Buenos dias, everyone. Today I want to focus on something very Foucauldian. And by that I mean I want to focus not on what Nietzsche says in the Genealogy of Morals, I want to focus on what he does. However, such a task is rather difficult because we don't know all that much about Nietzsche just yet, so my approach is going to be twofold. First, I'm going to focus on Nietzsche as a philosopher, and this involves talking about the major themes in his work and bringing together the different ways that his thinking is done through a set of concepts, and attempting to provide something of at least a cursory system for his thought. And the second thing I'm going to try to do is I'm going to approach the reading of the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals through the specific task of trying to demonstrate how a genealogy helps us uncover elements in our ethical thinking that we've either been taught to ignore or to bury in favor of valuing things that we believe are good and normal. Now, Nietzsche is exactly that kind of edgelord who has read way more ethical theory than you and kind of dunks on you in class and then turns to you immediately before the end of class and says, "Why so serious?" Uh, Wanting to punch Nietzsche is, I think, maybe the point. But he's trying to get across something that I think is very valuable, especially as we're thinking about ethics and ethical systems. So we're going to engage with him, but not without a few caveats. Anyway, here's part one. Nietzsche is born in the second half of the 19th century, and so he belongs to an era of thinkers who swam in the waters owned by Hegel and his followers. He's not trained as a philosopher, but he's trained as a philologist, which is a kind of comparative linguist or a thinker of the origins of words. And so he releases his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, to almost universal disgust by his peers, and nonetheless becomes a tenured professor at 24 because the book is a bombshell. And in many ways, Nietzsche's own life infects his work in much the same way that other thinkers like, say, Kierkegaard or Kant would, in that so much of who he is, he speaks about in his books. So when he talks about sickness, know that he suffered from these crippling migraines that were so powerful that he could only really work for about 120 days out of a year. He's a physically sick individual who explores sickness in his writing and sees it everywhere throughout the culture of Europe, and especially amongst his contemporaries. Now, eventually, Nietzsche retires from the university and he writes all about every manner of thing as an independent scholar. And he writes like a bunch of books in a 10-year period before he suffers from a kind of mental break that incapacitates him for the rest of his life, right? These are books like Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, and Justice for All, the Black Album. No, they all sound like metal albums, but the reality is that they're just a huge output of writing that is done by a guy who was physically ill and could really only work maybe 4 days a week. So we might ask ourselves then, what's so important about this guy's thought? Well, in order to do this, we need to examine four-ish major concepts in Nietzsche. And this is how I'm going to go about creating a kind of cursory system to Nietzsche. We're just going to examine these concepts and the way they connect to one another. And hopefully you'll be able to see them as you read the text of the genealogy. So, the first concept is probably one of his most famous. It's called the will to power. And beyond all intellect and manners, beyond all training lies desire. Human beings desire, and we desire beyond what we can realize. And this desire manifests itself through a will or a drive towards realizing that desire. And this desire then functions through the accumulation of power. And Nietzsche would say it's power all the way down. It's power as a force acting upon another force, will upon will, or altogether another force. In other words, to philosophize with a hammer, one of Nietzsche's good catchphrases, is to philosophize with force, is to provoke, is to write in polemic. And so what Nietzsche is doing is he is attacking concepts not to destroy them, but to hear how they resonate and how they impact other elements. Now Nietzsche is clear that the will to power is an affect. It catches us off guard when we find ourselves mad about something that we claim doesn't even matter at all. And it's kind of like a passion. It's a long-standing affect that drives us, affects us, motivates us, inspires us, but also kind of is us, your own most desire being the energy inside you that pushes you to do something, and it transforms itself from will into something intelligent. It becomes institutionalized. Now, as one of my professors in grad school put it, he said, the Nazis are not simply angry people. They've taken up a relationship to their anger, which is cold and calculated and becomes qualitatively transformed. Their evil is intelligence. And this intelligence can take the form of creating very ingenious systems of oppression that are aimed at those who are not of one's class. And these noble values then come to be denigrated and derided as moral failure, while the plebeian slavish values become systematized and valorized. The point that Nietzsche is trying to make is that these acts of desire end up becoming institutions, including institutions such as a moral law. And this leads us to our next pair of concepts, the active and the reactive. Now, I mentioned before that Nietzsche was talking about force, but here I want to say that Nietzsche is talking about force in a very particular way. He likes to separate them into two sets of forces. The first set of forces he calls active forces. These are noble, strong, powerful forces, right? These are the morals or the actions or values of those who already are sort of tough in his mind. And then you have the weak, or you have reactive forces, reactive, weak forces, herd morality, slave morality. These forces interact with the active forces through various kinds of conflict. And Nietzsche is very clear early on that the active and the reactive are not necessarily better than one another or worse than one another. One isn't good and the other bad or good or evil. Instead, these forces operate in a way that is constantly trying to one-up one another. And we see this play out in the world, is his wager. So, that sort of endless conflict leads us to the third concept that we can look for, which is the eternal return or the eternal recurrence of the same. In other words, Groundhog Day. So much about the way that human beings interact with the world is from the perspective that the world is bad and we must cope with it or make a new world that is better. And often, coping with the badness of the world is done through what Nietzsche calls asceticism. The ascetic ideal is where one attempts to purify or cleanse oneself and cleanse the world by purging ourselves of all bad desires, emotions, all irrational thoughts, indulgences, and decadence. And this approach is precisely backwards, according to Nietzsche. The condition for maintenance of oneself is to refuse to pity oneself. No, woe is me. No, oh, life is so terrible. But instead, by highlighting one's suffering, one seeks to gain attention. Oh, I'm so lonely. Oh, I feel so bad. Is the hope that people will come and pity you, according to Nietzsche. But this doesn't solve the problem, because the problem isn't loneliness. The problem, according to Nietzsche, is the belief that getting rid of loneliness will get rid of suffering. And there are plenty of people who live in relative solitude who are completely content with their lives, even as they don't lack suffering. So instead of viewing the world as bad, or as a passion, or suffering as bad, what if we viewed the world simply as it is, and we imagined as though all of our actions would happen eternally, like Groundhog Day? Everything you did, could you will that you could do that again and again and again and again? Can you say yes to the world? Can you deny self-pity? Can you embrace your own will to power despite dealing with the same thing over and over and over again? And if you can, maybe you're on the road to morals. But if you can't, maybe it's just power. This leads us to the transvaluation of all values. Simply put, our values are bad, and they've led us to a very bad place, and in order to overcome the bad places our values have led us, we need new values. But we can't just posit new ones, say, oh, this is a new value. We must overcome our own values. New values for a new kind of human, a human being that would be beyond good and evil. And this is what Nietzsche means by a transvaluation of all values, of looking at the values that we have in our current society and challenging them in such a way that these seemingly stable categories of good and evil end up getting unpacked, and we understand how they developed and how they shape the way that we engage with the world, or the things that we believe about the world. Now, these four concepts you can see scattered throughout all of Nietzsche's work. Some places they are much stronger than others, especially in the later work. And the Genealogy of Morals is kind of right in the middle. So you'll see a lot of will to power in the background. You'll see a lot of active and reactive, especially in this text. But you won't see as much eternal recurrence of the same. And he's aiming towards the transvaluation of all values. So he is headed in that direction. But in order to understand where he is and where he's going, we need to address the text itself. And we're going to do that in part 2. Good and bad, good and evil. Now, Nietzsche opens this first essay of the Genealogy of Morals by noting that there's a school of English psychologists, utilitarians, who have created a way of accounting for the development of morality. And the story that they offer is, for Nietzsche, completely unsatisfactory. So he's got to give a different account of how morality developed. Why is it important to talk about how morality developed? Well, it's important because if we know how morality came to be, we can uncover the ways that it changed, or how it arose within a particular historical context, rather than assuming that we've discovered some moral principle that's universal and eternal. In other words, it might be more true what Nietzsche uncovers than the stories we regularly tell ourselves about morality. Now, Nietzsche begins by positing that the difference between good and bad morality begins with the distance between the nobles and the plebeians. In other words, rather than some special source or divine fountain of morality, Nietzsche thinks that class differences between those who are noble and strong and those who are plebeian and weak are where morality comes from. Now, initially, the noble is seen as a truthful person, whereas the common or plebeian person lies. And this is all a matter of the construction of society. Nobles are above the common fray, and they're in charge of armies and fortunes, and Commoners are basically just concerned with their everyday lives. As a result, nobles have too much responsibility and can't afford to be untruthful, while a commoner has really no chance of becoming a noble, so they are perfectly free to lie, cheat, and steal in order to survive. Nietzsche is not judging these groups. He's just noting that there are possibilities in these class positions. And it's only when the struggle over the superiority of class or station becomes a struggle over the superiority of the soul that it becomes something new and different. And what Nietzsche is highlighting here is how a biological change, literally the ability to bathe, gets transformed into the superiority of a soul. In other words, purity, like moral purity, purity of soul, is not a matter of being able to wash oneself. It is a tactic of avoiding certain things that are deemed impure or bad. And it's within this context that Nietzsche introduces kind of the villain of this essay, the priest. Now, the character of the priest, and I'm going to emphasize the character of the priest, because it's not any particular religious tradition or particular kind of priest. This is a person who uses their ability to make myth and persuade people to change their values, which results in a transvaluation of values. And what makes these priests so dangerous, according to Nietzsche, is that they have this ability to turn their hatred into a kind of spirituality. Do they hate being impoverished? Blessed are the poor. Do they hate being disempowered? The Most High will bring the mighty down from their thrones. Do they fear for their earthly life? Store up treasures in heaven. Now, I'm being flippant here to make a Nietzschean point. If spirituality or morality are going to have any genuine value, then they're going to have to overcome being something other than just the wish fulfillment of lower class folks. According to Nietzsche, right? The transformation of morality occurs when, rather than who can keep their bum clean, is the distinction to who can keep their soul clean. And Nietzsche refers to this as a slave revolt in morality. Okay, very, very important side note that I want to make right now, and that is that there are a couple of things that we need to address before we move forward, namely Nietzsche's racial hierarchy that he's operating out of, and the potential for anti-Semitism that occurs in the text. Now, I want to be clear here that Nietzsche is operating out of a much older European model of racial hierarchy that is not anything similar to the way that a system of racial hierarchy would be understood or observed in the United States. Instead, this is much more strongly tied to geography. It's much more strongly tied to religious group or kin group. It's similar to the way that race is talked about in folks like Aristotle. Not anything like what we would talk about today. That said, out of this form of racial hierarchy or development that Nietzsche is talking about, you do get a lot of general pronouncements that have been taken very, very badly, and indeed might themselves be bad. So we should be skeptical of Nietzsche in this regard and not take him at his word. He is a person of his time, absolutely, but that doesn't mean that he's off the hook for the kinds of things that he says that might end up being, I don't know, real bad. I don't know why I'm standing like this. Maybe I should sit down. But, point number 2, anti-Semitism. When he uses the term specifically, the Jews, he's using it as an archetype and not as, like, actual people of Jewish descent or, like, people who are from Israel. And on the one hand, it's like, okay, that's understandable. On the other hand, it does, in fact, have strong connections to anti-Semitism historically. So we need to be very, very careful about it. You'll notice that I don't necessarily use that term, even though he does a lot, because I want to avoid, any anti-Semitism that I can, including when engaging with Nietzsche. So, without further ado, let's get back into it. But just remember, we got to be careful with Nietzsche. He's very important, but not without major, major flaws. The so-called slave revolt in morality begins with ressentiment, or the energy that comes from pushing back against those that you deem are holding you down. Nietzsche is quick to point out that this morality requires a hostile external world as something to react against. The world is bad. So what we do is we create our own values, and we create our own little moral enclave with our own movies and books and music and festivals and everything. And we take the strongest stance against the smallest offense. Why? Because if we don't take that stance now, all of society collapses. It's all gone. So we got to take that stance now, or it's all gone. So, where does this leave us with Nietzsche and morality? What does this weird story about the strong and the weak, the noble and the herd, have anything to do with actual ethics and not some red pill edgelord nonsense? Well, Nietzsche certainly doesn't do himself any favors in that regard. There are plenty of folks who see themselves as strong and noble, pushing back against the herd mentality of those who demand that everyone take everything so seriously. But I think that Nietzsche is actually helpful for any of us who dare to be ethical. I like to think of Nietzsche as the debugger operation you might run when writing a computer program, or like the dye they put in you when you get a CAT scan. Like, Nietzsche is out here not wanting to watch the world burn while asking, like, why so serious, or dancing on some stairs. Instead, Nietzsche is asking us to think about morality and to think about what we consider good and who we consider evil, and question the moral categories we've come to feel comfortable with. Are we creating moral codes because we believe that they're bringing about a genuinely better world? Or are we attempting to maintain and even increase our power and then draping that in moral costuming? We need to question our moral categories because we might just be using it as an exercise in protecting our comforts rather than doing what we think is good. Or not. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video. Adios.